Castle of St. Donats, Volume 3, Chapter 9. Epigraph. Lo, from the top of yonder cliff that shrouds its airy head amidst the azure clouds, stands the old castle. Unknown. 'Twas night ere the vessel which bore the young soldier reached the Cambrian shore, while the pale brightness of the moon softened the well-known scene around him. When our hero came opposite the rocky cliffs of St. Donats, unusual rapture glowed through his whole frame. The beloved spot of his youth recalled the pure and innocent pleasures of that happy period when, free from the cares of the great world, he imbibed the pure dictates of virtue from the mouth of Mr. Freeman. Mr. Freeman, his more than father, who had first formed his unstamped mind, and who had afterwards snatched him from the precipice of destruction. The remembrance of that gloomy deed which he had once impiously dared to plan, and almost to perpetrate, never failed to fill his whole soul with religious awe and gratitude. He thought of it as he descended from the side of the boat, which the captain of the merchantman had sent to conduct him and his trusty servant to the shore, and he breathed a fervent, though silent, prayer of thanks as he stepped his foot upon the ground. With his mind filled with no unpleasant thought, he leisurely ascended the hill towards the castle. His more heavy baggage he left at a fisherman's hut upon the beach, and the faithful Brown, walking by his side, carried a small portmanteau. All was still around, not a leaf stirred, not a cloud was to be seen. The soft murmuring of the waves but more strongly marked the general silence, and the placid mistress of the night seemed to personify the calm. On a sudden a footstep caught our hero's attention. "Brown," said he. "Stay, see, 'tis the spectre of the well." "Oh, good Lord, deliver us," repeated his terrified companion as he dropped the portmanteau and instinctively grasped his sword. The figure seemed to hear the ejaculation, and perceiving the strangers, quickened its pace. Our youth, who was at no great distance from it, clearly saw a bloody bandage which entwined the temples, and which the moon made plainly visible. "If thou art a spirit of the other world," said he, "in the name of that almighty deity whom we all obey, say who thou art, and why thus restless thou frequentest these paths." The spectre had now reached the neighbouring bushes that surrounded the well, and turning to the voice in a slow, hollow tone, said, "I am the rightful lord of these domains. I injure no one, and seek but a small portion of that which is my own." Instantly it vanished through the shades, and left our hero more amazed than ever. Brown, appalled with unknown fears, stood riveted to the spot. His hair bristled, his whole frame shook, but instinct had aided him to draw his sword, which he held almost uselessly in his hand. "Come," said Smith, "there is no danger. It is gone." "I don't fear danger, you're on a nose," replied the other, "but I can't help fearing the devil and all his works. Not that I mean to say that the good gentleman we just saw has anything to do with the devil, but—" "Come," continued his master, "take up the portmanteau. We're just at the castle. It never enters the buildings." This news somewhat recovered Brown, and he walked with his sword still drawn close to his master. When they came to the entrance of the bushes, our hero again stopped. One moment he thought of following the apparition, but the general prohibition of Mr. Freeman returned upon his mind, and the will of the curate of St. Donats was as much law to John Smith, Esquire, captain of a troop of horse, as ever it had been to little Jack Smith, the child of charity. While he stopped involved in thought, his companion, who was somewhat recovered of his fright, stooped for the portmanteau, and seeing something glitter at a distance, picked it up and said to his master, "Sir, you've dropped the little crucifix you always carry." "Indeed," said Smith. "Ah, so I have. My fears had like to have been more prejudicial than yours." They immediately walked on, and soon arrived at the castle. Is it necessary to say with what heartfelt joy the two friends embraced, or can I describe to whom the meeting was most grateful? After mutual congratulations, Smith mentioned the circumstance of the spectre which had just happened. "I was nearly, sir," concluded he, "losing my little ivory crucifix," the history of which Mr. Freeman very well knew. "Brown picked it up near the spot where the figure entered the bushes. How could I drop it? But surely I feel it," added he, "now in my bosom." As he spoke, he produced it still hanging from the string to which it was tied round his neck, and hastily searching his waistcoat pocket, drew out the one Brown had picked up. The gentlemen narrowly examined both, nor could they perceive the most trifling difference. Again and again they compared them together. The black silk ribbon to which Smith's was tied was the only thing by which he knew his own. Many times in town Mr. Freeman had remarked the excellency of the work of the one Smith wore, He had said no common artist could make even a good imitation of it. But here, on a sudden, by ways most strange, was found one exactly similar. It was evident that the crucifix had not lain there any time. It was perfectly unsoiled, and there was no one in that neighbourhood likely to have a thing of the kind. In short, every conjecture seemed to say it must have been the property of the spectre. But the gentlemen, both of them, thought it strange, without entering into metaphysical disquisitions, that an aerial form, void of earthly substance, should bear about with him the things of this world, however he might choose still to be a temporary inhabitant here. Full of doubts, the gentlemen were retiring to rest when Mr. Freeman said, "I shall detain you a few moments upon another affair. I'd almost forgot. I mean, Miss Maudley." Smith, alarmed at the well-known name, coloured, and fetching a deep sigh, said, "You mean Sir Lady Swain, indeed. I hope she is well." "Miss Maudley is well," replied Mr. Freeman, "and though I have no hopes to give you, I think you will not be less happy to hear that she never has been Lady Swain, or any other than Miss Maudley, and the account you saw in the papers was purposely put in to induce the world to suppose that she soon would be Sir Sandy's, and to hasten the match." "My dear sir," said Smith, "when did you hear this? Who put the account in the papers? Is the match off with Sir Sandy?" "I can only tell you," said Mr. Freeman, "Sir Sandy is supposed to be the author of it. The match, I believe, is off, and I did not hear it till a little before I received your letter, in which you said that you expected soon to be sent to England. I will say no more at present. Good night. I don't think you will rest the worse, though you may sleep the less, for the nightcap I've given you." The gentlemen separated, and Smith, with a light heart, ascended to his room. The occurrences of the evening were of too forcible a nature to be easily dismissed from his mind. The moon shone bright. He felt no immediate inclination for sleep. He therefore extinguished his candle, and drew a chair to the window of his apartment. He was so wrapped in the pleasing thoughts that his soul's idol, Miss Maudley, was still single, that it was some minutes before he perceived the spectre of the well walking backwards and forwards on its usual walk. He now attentively observed it, and plainly perceived that with downcast looks it narrowly examined the ground. One while it stopped and seemed to stoop forward. Again it walked slowly onward and turned at the corner. The method of its proceeding was quite different from its wonted custom, for it usually crossed the path and seldom returned till hours after, and very often was no more visible on that night. Smith had no doubt in his own mind that it was looking for the crucifix, and every moment satisfied him more fully of its belonging to the spectre. After noticing the phantom for some time, he went down to Mr. Freeman's room, and gently knocking at the door, Mr. Freeman awaked, inquired who was there, and pulled up the draw-bolt. Our hero told him the circumstance, and asked if he had any objection to his going down alone and attempting to converse with the figure. "I can no longer, my dear sir, think it a supernatural being. Surely this crucifix must belong to it, and were I to go down alone to return it, perhaps the person might not avoid me." Mr. Freeman assented, and promised to be a distant spectator from the window that, in case of treachery, he might come to his assistance. Captain Smith was soon at the spot, and he hid himself behind a large tree till the figure was at the further end of the walk. He then stepped forward. The figure started. "Rash man, beware how you thus disturb my walks. Know your life is in my power." Our hero had stopped the moment the other saw him, and replied, "I mean not to molest you, whoever you are, but a strange circumstance induces me to speak to you. As we crossed this night your path, my servant picked up an ivory crucifix. Deceived by the likeness to one of my own, I took it into the castle before I perceived my mistake. I have since from my window observed your actions as those of a man looking for a thing that he had lost, and this brings me here." "The crucifix is mine," replied the figure in a less hollow voice. "Are you a man of honour?" added he emphatically. "Can I trust you?" "Do my actions show me otherwise?" replied our hero. "I came here in the garb of a soldier, but my sword is undrawn. My intentions are neither hostile nor deceitful." Pardon me a moment's doubting," said the other warmly. "Hear then in a few words my motives for this life, which must seem strange to you, so strange. Need I say to you, I am no spectre. The bandage which entwines my temples is meant an allusion to the old tales of this castle, and I solemnly employ it for the purpose of permitting me to draw the remains of a wretched life unmolested in this retired spot. I trust to your honour that you divulge not my secret. and I thank you for restoring me a pledge far more valuable than life itself." "I feel," said our hero in a friendly tone, "an interest in your fate that tells me I ought not to leave you. Mr. Freeman, the worthy minder of this place, is the only one that knows of my thus meeting you. Of his word and honour I am as certain as of my own. And my servant, who was with me when I met you before, is fully convinced that you are not a terrestrial being. May I not then ask you to communicate to us the unhappy cause which thus separates you from the society of men? And I here promise in our joint names to be silent and faithful to the sacred trust reposed in us." The person paused a moment, then said, "I believe, and I will satisfy you. But when and where?" "Surely," said Smith, "in the daytime and in another garb you sometimes appear." "Undoubtedly," replied the other. "I take off this ancient cloak and the bloody bandage and appear as another man." "Will you come then to the castle and inquire for Mr. Freeman?" "I will, tomorrow at 11. Good night was exchanged by the parties. The stranger, having taken the crucifix, walked toward the well, and Smith returned into the house. Mr. Freeman, from the window of his chamber, had seen the peacefulness of their demeanour, and as our hero entered the room, he accosted him. "Bringest thou airs from heaven? A blast from hell?" "Well, that, sir," said he, "you shall yourself be judge." "How so?" "Tomorrow the spectre of the well will do us the honour of a visit at 11 o'clock, and he has promised us some aerial food that shall satisfy all the cravings of our inquisitive appetites." Mr. Freeman smiled. Smith told him the particulars of their late conversation, and then retired to his own room. Reclined on his couch, he courted not the influence of the obliterating deity. Swiftly flew along the wakeful hours, while the occurrences of the evening passed agreeably before him. But chiefly the form of his Eliza floated in his mind's eye, and visions of hope, long banished, again exhilarated his heart. Steadily he scrutinized the latter part of his life since he had left his native country, and conscience smiled upon the remembrance. Ever thankful to that all-directing invisible power which had snatched him from endless ruin, he at last resigned himself to repose. Short though sweet were his slumbers, and he awoke in the morning refreshed and invigorated. Chapter 10. Epigraph. Their thirst no bounds and no distinction knows. The more they drink, the more the fever glows. Statius Thebed. It is natural to suppose that Mr. Freeman and the young captain were anxious for the promised visit from the strange acquaintance. Smith thought the castle clock could never strike 11, and Mr. Freeman was every 5 minutes pulling out his watch. The clock had at last scarcely struck the promised hour before a gentleman inquired for Mr. Freeman, and was shown into the room, where he sat with Smith. All parties seemed very much agitated as he entered, and Smith, walking up to him, said, "I presume, sir, you are the gentleman who promised me this favour last night?" The other, who was evidently very much affected, answered in the affirmative, and Mr. Freeman, having handed him a chair, begged he would be seated. The agitation of their guest now so greatly increased that Mr. Freeman pressed him very much to take a cordial. The stranger answered that he should soon be better, but would be obliged to him for a glass of port wine. Smith's eyes were riveted on his new acquaintance, who was a fine, graceful man, plainly dressed, with a strong and expressive countenance, which sorrow had rendered somewhat stern. He appeared about 45, though his hair, long and as white as snow, and a beard cut short but not shaved, gave him at first a much older appearance. Both the gentlemen could not help remarking the ease and dignity of his person and the expressive manner in which he spoke. After a few words of general conversation, turning to Smith, the stranger said, "I told you, sir, last night, that I was the rightful lord of this castle. I repeat the same now. The developing of my history will clearly explain it to you. Know, then, I am the eldest son of the Duc de Merite. I came over early in life to England, and so impressed was I with respect for this genuine land of freedom, that I determined it should be the future residence of my life. I married, therefore, an English lady, Eleanor Willis, great niece of Thomas Gwynn, Esquire, the last owner who inhabited the castle. But my unhappy spouse, who, by the failure of the male issue, was next in succession, I might claim this estate for my life. Mr. Gwynn died the day before we left England. My poor Nelly lived not long after. I have been from about the same period supposed to be no more, and Sir J. Morgan now enjoys the property and the right of the younger sister. You see, therefore, the justice of my claim were inclined to make it." I returned to my melancholy story. When I occasionally resided in France, I was a constant advocate for the people against the haughty and domineering spirit which the French nobility exerted, which was so contrary to my feelings. In vain my unhappy parents cautioned me against encouraging that licentious temper that already began to show itself among the French people. I turned a deaf ear, and thought only of the cause of freedom. Youth and impetuosity proved my bane. I had no kind reflecting friend to point out to me my error. I conceived that I should be the grand means of making 25 millions of people happy, and I rashly helped overturn the old fabric that crushed us all in its fall. From the very first I had not the most distant idea of annihilating the power of the throne, and when I arrived in France after my marriage and found the baneful intentions of the leaders of the mob, I was the foremost to attempt to stem the rushing torrent. In the earlier ages of the Revolution, my name had been echoed through France as the grand guardian of its liberty. When I returned from England, the leaders of the mob hailed me as their champion, but I soon showed them how fallacious were their expectations. The unhappy king, under the semblance of royalty, was in reality a prisoner in one of his old palaces to a set of wretches whom a vicious confusion had noted with power. I instantly determined to release my sovereign and to reinstate him again on the throne of his ancestors. I planned his escape. I aided personally in the business and rode forward myself, post to apprise B of his coming. Well, there must have been our disappointment when we found that everything had failed, and that the ill-fated Louis was about to fall a martyr to his humanity. I hastened back again to France to my beloved wife, determined to convey her safe to England, and once more attempt to rescue my sovereign. But before I arrived at Paris, I received the dreadful tidings that the Duke and Duchess of Merité had been murdered by their own peasants, by the very people to whom they had always acted in the most kind and affectionate manner. The Duke had ever been considered as the father of the poor, and my venerable mother had spent her whole life in acts of humanity and goodness. My blood runs cold, even while I think of it. The wretched villain Montcoursure never yet polluted the earth, though, alas, I fear there are too many such remaining. This hell-begotten miscreant headed the frantic mob. He himself was an attorney, born, bred, and nourished in the bosom of our house, raised from the dregs of the commonalty by the generosity of my father, to whom he was steward. This monster inflamed the maddening populace by his speeches, and was the first to plunge the dagger in the bosom of his benefactor. Oh my God, forgive the fury that observed me when I heard the soul-harrowing news. I was going to my father's favourite castle at Paisha. Instantly I urged forward to the spot, and was met by the chief assassin and his accomplices a few miles from the castle. My steady eye marked the villain out. I plunged my horse into the midst of the group. Not for a moment did I lose sight of him, till I buried my faithful sword up to the hilt in his heart. The Duke paused, and labouring with the agitation of his soul, it was some time before he could proceed. I was fired at by the wretches, and received a great many wounds, among others a severe one in my thigh, of which I shall never perfectly recover. In this maimed state I reached Paris, where I had left my beloved wife at the house of a trusty friend, who was too much of the democrat to allow me any fears of her being discovered. I arrived late in the evening at the same house, determined to go with my wife to England immediately with what property I could at present muster. But the day after my arrival, my thigh was so inflamed by the exercise that the surgeon at first feared a mortification would ensue. He positively ordered me not to stir under danger of my life, and my friend promised to get my wife a safe passage from Calais. I'd almost forgot to mention a circumstance concerning the great value of the little crucifix that was picked up last night. A most ingenious artisan at Paris, who was at that time confined to the common prison, made me two. Perhaps, sir, said our hero, no longer able to contain herself, there might be a third, for I have the exact model of the same in my bosom, which, as you must remember, I mentioned was the occasion of my taking it home last night. It may, sir, said the stranger gravely. Some distant resemblance of it, but the poor artist perished soon after by the guillotine. The four sides of my crucifix exhibit, by the shade the exact profile of the late King and Queen of France, the Dauphin, and the lovely survivor of the family, the Madame Royale. It has also 4 screws in different parts, which open, and the hair of the 4 august personages whom I have mentioned is contained in the small cavity covered by each screw. Smith drew his crucifix from his bosom, and as he took the string from his neck, the Duke started at the well-known object. This, sir, said the youth, was stolen from my mother on her deathbed. She died in childbirth of me at a small village in Wiltshire, where she came in the coach from Bristol, and was unknown. 23 years have since passed over. I was nursed by the parish and never yet knew my parents. Our hero, as he spoke, gave the crucifix to the Duke, who, eagerly listening to every word that he spoke, with a trembling hand soon opened the first screw and exclaimed in rapture, "Gracious heaven, then you are my son." Chapter 11. Epigraph. Who noble ends by noble means obtains, or failing smiles in exile or in chains. Like good Aurelius, let him reign or bleed, like Socrates, that man is great indeed. Pope. It were hard to say who was the most amazed at this strange discovery, which time and circumstances too strongly corroborated to leave a doubt in the mind of the father. When all parties had somewhat recovered from their surprise, the Duke continued, "With my own hands did I tie the crucifix round the neck of your poor mother when we last parted, as she in return did the same office for me. My friend at whose house I was in Paris saw my dear Nelly safe to Calais. She was at the time far gone in the family way, had got no children, and dreaded the danger of her longer staying in France, conscious how very hazardous it would be to escape the care of a little child. The vessel she sailed in I knew was bound to Bristol, and it was settled that she was to take a place in the London coach immediately on her landing. In London she was certain to find some friends and relations, and I promised to join her there as soon as my wounds would permit. In a few weeks after I followed, but was never able to gain the least trace of her from Bristol. Indeed, I called at a small inn in the village of Pitford on account of an advertisement concerning a young female who had died there, but the description which the people of the house gave was so totally different, the clothes, too, which they showed me, were those of a person in a low situation, that I could perceive no traces of my lost Nelly. Smith now informed him that it was the same village and the same person, and with every particular circumstance that had come to his knowledge related the means which had been taken to conceal who the person was. He mentioned also the peculiar circumstance of his gaining the crucifix, and afterwards meeting with the very man who had kept the inn at the time. He ended with saying that of all the valuables which the unhappy lady brought from France, the crucifix alone remained, and the lady's wedding ring buried with her. When Smith spoke of the ring, the Duke said, "I have no longer in mine own mind even the shadow of a doubt of your being my son. Yet the circumstance of the ring will put it out of the possibility of suspicion, as my name and the maiden name of my ever-to-be-regretted Nelly, with the day of our marriage, are engraven in the inside, and it is not yet, I hope, too late to be able to recover it." Mr. Freeman informed him that they were going in a few days into that neighbourhood on a visit to a gentleman, now a colonel in the army, who had been the original instrument of raising his son from that obscurity in which the unhappy death of his mother had left him. The Duke, after agreeing to be one of the party, thus continued his narrative. "After my fruitless search for my beloved wife in England, I again returned to France, determined to rescue and preserve my sovereign or perish in the attempt. It will be needless for me now to repeat the various means I employed. They all failed. The royal party was disheartened. Not a man would assist in any daring enterprise, but tamely suffered themselves to be led, day after day, without a struggle to the guillotine. In this manner things continued. The most humane monarch on the face of the earth was brought to an open trial for crimes his very soul abhorred. In vain was he defended, was every accusation refuted, was every charge proved to be false, he was declared guilty, and condemned to lose his head. You too well know all the particulars of that horrid affair. As a last resource, I had agreed with a few other friends to hail our monarch at the place of execution and attempt to make a division in his favour. But I was not fated to lose my life in that glorious cause. I was by some means or other discovered the day before and instantly confined in the common prison. I saw not the dreadful sight, but have since heard that one only of our party had spirit enough to cry out for his sovereign, and that he nobly perished a martyr upon the spot, murdered by the wretches around him. My trial, if it may be called a trial, was soon over. I was not suffered to speak in my defence, but ordered to be guillotined the next morning. Since all hopes had now left me of being of service to my king and my country, self-preservation, which I did not cowardly shrink from, induced me to save at least mine own life, a life I was ever willing to risk in the cause of virtue, but which I knew I had no right, however burdensome it might be, to wantonly resign. As I was looked upon to be a criminal of great consequence, and was to be the grand victim of the morrow for the amusement of the populace, I was confined in a dungeon alone, strictly guarded. I had contrived to secrete with great art a few valuable diamonds about me, and these I offered to the head jailer if he would permit my escape. He accepted the tempting bait, and in the guise of a national courier I soon arrived at Calais. I lost no time in conjunction with 2 Englishmen I found there in planning our escape. We seized a small vessel in the night, and hoisting the sails we steered, all of us unacquainted with the sea, toward the English coast. When the morn arose, instead of the chalky cliffs of England which we had hoped to see, an impenetrable fog hid everything from our view, and for 4 days and nights we were driven about by the winds. Our masts broke, the rigging destroyed, and uncertain which way we were going. What property we had got, each of us had concealed in his clothes. On the 5th night the vessel struck. I swam on shore. My unhappy companions went down with the wreck. I soon reached the land opposite the castle of St. Donat's, a place I very well remembered, having spent many weeks here with the late owner. The old steward, who considered me as one at a future day likely to be the master of the castle, had frequently told me the anecdotes of the wonderful well, and I believe that I am the only person living who is possessed of the secret. In the civil wars of York and Lancaster, a large and roomy apartment had been formed adjoining to the well by the careful Lord Atbourne, as a safe retreat for a time against the success of the opposite party. To this apartment there were 2 ways, one from the castle, which by the falling in of the old ruinous buildings has been for many years stopped and totally impossible, passable and lost, the other by means of the well. On the eastern side of the well is a wooden catch bolt strengthened by iron, which, to a person descending into the well, has only the appearance of a beam, by drawing the catch part aside, easily to be done by the hand in stooping down, or when you are acquainted with the spot by a judicious kick of the foot as you descend. The pretended beam turns immediately upon its axis, and a machine not unlike a small tub, which is supported from the farther end, comes directly before the mouth of the well. Into this you easily and safely descend. You turn a small nail which prevents the bolt from catching, and stooping down pull yourself to the entrance of the apartment by a strong iron chain which is fastened to the wall of the machine. The other end of the beam then slides into place, and everything looks the same as before, and you fasten the machine back by the chain. When you ascend again from the well, you have only to push yourself back in the machine, which is without any difficulty done, as it moves very easily on its axis, and having removed the nail, the bolt catches of itself. Among the craggy rocks there are many fissures, which fully light the front apartment, and admit the air, invisible from the ground, and protected by the yawning precipices. I know not if I have explained myself clearly on the subject. You shall judge by the place itself. Permit me to inquire, sir, said Mr. Freeman, why no human traces were to be perceived in the morning? When I came within a certain distance of the well, continued the Duke, I constantly fastened a piece of wood to the middle of my shoes, of which I made different kinds, some with the form of a horse's foot, others of the goat, sheep, ox, and dog, as I thought it best to use. This was the reason no footsteps of a human being were to be found, and still added to my height. May I beg to know, rejoined Mr. Freeman, how you avoided the shots which once were fired at you? The curate, by the other, a bold, forward man, had frequently followed and watched me before. I was therefore always prepared for him, and never left the well without first elevating a figure dressed like myself. Such was the thing you have heard they shot at. The shots indeed went through it, and I had reason to praise my caution. Mr. Freeman thanked him, and the Duke continued. Dark and gloomy was the night when I was shipwrecked on this spot, and I made what haste I could to the cottages in my vale to dry my clothes and rest myself for the night. The people humanely received me. I now occasionally call there, and sometimes employ them to get me a few necessaries without their having the least idea that I live in the neighbourhood. They consider me as a kind of travelling pedlar, and I found them of the greatest service to me. The day after the shipwreck I began to review my helpless lot. Every comfort of life was lost to me, and religion alone prevented me from putting an end to my existence. My venerable parents had untimely perished, the victims to those principles which I myself had been one of the first to propagate and spread over my unhappy country. My beloved partner of my cares I was certain was no more, though by what misfortune was as yet unknown to me. I had no family to protect, I had no friend to whom I could be of service, and well knowing that in a great degree I had cherished and hastened mine own ruin by the misuse of those principles I had fatally imbibed and propagated, I considered myself as a disagreeable object even to those of the same party. My lameness, too, from a wound in my thigh was certain for life. The wound indeed was healed, but some of the muscles were destroyed and incapable of being again of use. I can walk tolerably well, but cannot get any pace that requires a spring. When I had again and again considered all these things, I determined for the remainder of my life to fix up my residence at the Well. I went off a few days after to London to place the whole of what moneys I had at different times remitted to England in the public funds, and twice a year I have regularly gone to town to receive my dividends. When I arrived in London, I met with an old acquaintance, an Englishman to whom I entrusted my story. I wished not to be considered any longer as alive, and without mentioning my particular residence, I placed my money in the funds in a borrowed name, and my friend promised in case of necessity to receive it for me, and send it wherever I should direct. I was more induced to the scheme of being no longer known to the world by a full account which I saw in a French paper of the events of the following day after I had escaped from the prison. In this paper, which was written directly under the eyes of the leaders of the French government at that time, I found no mention whatever made of my escape, but the particulars of my death described, and even a speech of contrition was inserted, which was said I had spoken on the scaffold. The occasion of this strange circumstance I have since discovered, which proves to be this. The moment my escape was made known to the French tyrants, they were greatly enraged with the jailer and threatened him with the guillotine. But as I was to have been the grand spectacle for the horrid tragedy of the succeeding day, they determined, on second thoughts, that another should personate me. The people might not be disappointed. The jailer produced a man fit for the purpose. A written speech was given him, and he was promised a full pardon under the pretence that I, after being exhibited to the populace, was to have been executed in private. On what slender holds will not the dying wretch catch? He foolishly believed them. His head being shaved and dressed in the garb of a criminal, the distant populace knew not the difference. He performed his part to admiration. He boldly read the speech, in which I was made to confess the justice of my punishment and my personal ingratitude to the people. But the moment he had finished, and falsely hoped to descend the scaffold in safety, the drums and trumpets sounded, the executioner seized him, and his head was off in an instant. I have nothing further to add to my melancholy tale than that, finding I had been long dead to the world, I persisted in my former resolution and took up my general residence at the apartments of the Well. A little while after I had been here, I found I could claim the castle as my own for life in right of my wife, but I had 200 a year coming to me from the moneys in my funds, a sum vastly superior to my present wants. I generally keep about 50 guineas by me. All my expenses in the year do not amount to much more than that sum, and the remainder of my income I distribute among the many poor objects of my countrymen, whom I continually meet with in my rambles. The apartments of the Well I have always considered as my home. Though many years I have been there but a few months, particularly if I had any idea of being discovered, I immediately absented myself, and when I have noticed anyone watching me, I have not been visible for some time. By these means I probably never should have been discovered, had it not been for what I shall now always consider the lucky adventure of last night. Chapter 12. Epigraph. Yes, let the rich deride, the proud disdain these simple blessings of the lowly train. To me more dear, congenial to my heart, one native charm than all the gloss of art. And e'en while fashion's brightest arts decoy, the heart mistrusting asks if this be joy. Goldsmith's Deserted Village. In the evening, the Duke conducted Mr. Freeman and his son to the apartments in the Well. They were astonished at the neatness and conveniency of the place. The broken cliffs in the rock, with very little aid from art, gave sufficient light into a large apartment. And behind was a small one, which was fitted up as a chamber, and a glass door prevented the total darkness which must otherwise have taken place. When I first came here, said the Duke, the old furniture was quite decayed and useless. At different times I have brought what you have seen. There was no door to the bedchamber, and that which you see at present is the work of my hands. I have also added glasses to the fissures in the rock. In short, all my leisure time has been employed in improving what I once thought would have been my habitation for life. Well, I trust, my dear sir, said our hero, you have given over every thought of that kind. Yes, my son, replied the sire. I live now for you, and will soon investigate and substantiate the proofs which are to put you in possession of the castle of St. Donat's. The present owner is not only a rich, but a worthy and respectable man. With pleasure will he resign a trifle to reinstate you in your rights. At the same time, it is proper these rights should be clearly proved, and with the testimonies we can already provide, the circumstance of the ring will at once clear up the whole. The gentleman, having sufficiently admired the apartments of the well, prepared to return. The Duke accompanied them, as Mr. Freeman had before ordered apartments to be fitted up at the castle. The following morning, after breakfast, the Duke thus addressed Mr. Freeman and his son. I had a strong contest last night with the lurking remains of my pride and vanity, and I finally gained the victory. I trust you, Mr. Freeman, and my son will approve. Long have I given up all thoughts of my native country. I wish only to forget it. Here has been my asylum, here are my possessions, here are my friends and relations. Shall I bear then a useless title, a title unmeaning? For a France tomorrow reinstated to its former glory, I never would again join its legislators or warriors, never lift up my arm and turn my thoughts against the country that has nourished me, a wretched outcast in her bosom. With these principles, with these sentiments, can I any longer call myself a peer of France? France and its peers are no more. And shall I avail myself of the courtesy of this country, and pride myself upon the shadow of a name? The advantages attendant on that name I have irrevocably lost. Why then should I keep the tawdry term? Pride and vanity with me to retain such honours which remind me of my rashness, my misfortunes, and my losses. Let me then divest myself of this bauble, and while I enjoy the benefits of an Englishman, let me glory also in the name. The expanding countenance and beaming eye of our hero clearly showed how agreeable these sentiments were. Eagerly grasping the paternal hand, he said with energy replied, I no otherwise rejoice that I am the son of the Duke de Merite than that you, Sir, are he. This alone is my pride. All other honours I willingly and joyfully resign. The father looked what silent nature alone can express. He pressed him in his arms, then turning to Mr. Freeman, he affectionately took him by the hand, and with a look of gratitude as thanking him for such a son, added, What says my friend Mr. Freeman? Does he approve of our intentions? Mr. Freeman replied he not only approved, but applauded them. Mr. Freeman indeed enumerated many worldly advantages that attended even the name of a title, but he reprobated such contemptible vanities, and much more the mind which would be pleased with them. He mentioned also many disadvantages, and drew a ludicrous picture of pride and poverty without power. And he concluded an excellent speech, which I wish I could favour the reader with, but which, if he is anxious to know the substance of, is only to ask any of his young acquaintance from Westminster, Eton, Harrow, Winchester, Rugby, the Charterhouse, etc., 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 for their best composition on the subject, nobilitas sola et atacia unica, virtus. Happiness, continued the father of our hero, is indeed more equally distributed than we generally suppose. The poor think the rich are most happy. The rich, indeed, have the outward appearance of it, and the poor of misery, but look within. A superb dwelling, the fine clothes and delicate viands are no longer the means of happiness to a great man. Custom makes them common and often loathsome, while discontent, ill health, and the greatest of all evils, idleness, make him far more wretched than the poor fellow whose simple labour, natural to man, gives him health, spirits, and expels that dreadful lassitude of thought. O idleness, in what terms can I sufficiently depreciate thee? Yes, thou art in truth the gaudy badge of gentry, the baneful distinction between rich and poor. Thou art a cruel stepmother to every son of order, regularity, and discipline. But thou art the fostering nurse of villainy, the all-sufficient bane both of the body and of the mind. Twin brother of greatness, I have had enough of you both. Your sweets, though many, are cloying, your bitters, if few, are lasting, till thou, blessed offspring of labour and independence, thou hast never deceived me. Thou givest more than thou promised, and leavest no sting behind. But if, for one moment, I look forward to that eternal state of a hereafter, then it is that I see thy dangerous preeminence, O greatness. I see thee surrounded with the goods of fortune, the steward of thy God. I see thee called to a long and dreadful reckoning. I fear the issue of thy final account. Pride and selfish conceit throw their tempting baubles in thy way. Honours, titles, and distinctions blind thy view, and the same veil that hides the hideous form of vice conceals also the beauteous countenance of virtue. Lost in the maze of vanity, the fiends flattery and falsehood dress themselves in the specious garb of friends, and hasten thee to irrevocable ruin. Such have been the thoughts, my dear son, which have employed the hours of my meditation, and have fixed me in my present determination. Nor can my religion be any impediment to my final residence in this country. For though I was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith, since I came to the years of mature judgment, I have made profession of none other but the Christian. I abhor all separating names of sectaries and distinction. I am neither of Paul or Apollos or of Cephas, but of Christ. Luther or Calvin, Wesley or priestly, papist, Protestant or dissenter are nothing to me. That pure gospel which Christ first taught is the sole rule of my conduct. My favour hereafter I draw from that alone, nor do I attempt to impose upon others my weak and human conceptions, whatever they may be. It is my endeavour to fulfil the spirit more than the letter of the Christian law, and if with a good intention I should err in any trifle, I have no doubt the God of all justice and mercy will pity and forgive me. Such sentiments were most congenial to the liberal mind of Mr. Freeman and our hero. This, cried the former, not a little inflamed with the rapture of the subject, this is the pure spirit of Christianity. All distinctions are the base offspring of pride and sedition, the policy of the worldly wise, the instigations of the devil. I honour, I glory in your principles, and from my soul I abominate those flowery orations, metaphysical distinctions, exempt allusions, and metaphorical labyrinths of all the folders of a name from to. By this the simplicity of our religion has been so frequently contaminated. By this a wild field of unbelief has been laid open to the sceptic. Yes, I abominate, but I fear my zeal has carried me too far, that I myself shall be liable to that censure I was about to bestow on others. While my weak frame, my imperfect thoughts, my confined senses all tell me I am dependent on a supreme being, shall I pretend to determine what he ought to do, or what he can do? Shall I compare his power, nature, and capacity with mine, which I every day feel have their limits set them? No, let me rest satisfied with what his holy word has taught me, and by acting up to that, I cannot err. The sacred scriptures, I am sure you're both convinced with me, are his word, and the grand rule of right and wrong is too clear to be misunderstood, even if the mistakes, errors, and prejudices of the translators, transcribers, and innovators were 1,000 times the number that they are. My scepticism, again Mr. Freeman checked himself, and addressing the father of our hero said, since you've resigned one name, have you chosen another in its stead? Yes, replied the gentleman. The name my son bears is as respectable as any other, and since chance has given him one so truly British, I never intend to change it. The sums I have in the funds are in the name of Brown. Mr. Freeman smiled at his attachment to the common English terms, but when I next see my friend Mr. Moodley, they shall be changed to Smith. Mr. Moodley, sir, did you say? Replied our hero. Is it Mr. Moodley of York? The same, replied the father. You know him, perhaps? I was acquainted with him some years ago. He has a lovely daughter, continued the senior. The son was all attention. You may perhaps have heard of her. My friend has met with a great deal of trouble concerning an estate that is left to Miss Moodley and a first cousin of hers, a baronet, provided she marries him at the age of 21. The young lady never liked her cousin, and her father has often lamented to me that he greatly feared a young adventurer whom she had by accident got acquainted with had estranged her affections. But that this has been some time removed, and her love for the unworthy object no more, yet the colour rose in Smith's face as his father spoke. His swelling heart prevented his speaking, and fixing a look on his friend Freeman, which the other quickly understood, he hastened out of the room. The father, surprised, was about to follow him when Mr. Freeman begged his attention for a few minutes while he circumstantially detailed his son's first acquaintance, affection, and attachment to Miss Moodley. The expanding hopes which now presented themselves from the absolute dismission of Sir Sandy Simeon Swain was next explained, and the penitence and reformation of our hero. The senior Mr. Smith, for by his own desire we will so call him, heard every word with attention. His warm heart was interested for his son, and he felt for his success with the same ardour as if it had been his own cause. Smith had before told him the chief occurrences in his life, and Mr. Freeman, who was more and more pleased with the open and generous mind of the father, related every particular which the youth had slightly noticed. Nor did the faithful narrator omit the errors, faults, and crimes, and his final victory over them. Again and again did the enraptured father strike his hands together and thank his God who had given him such a son. And again did he express his gratitude to him who had been the humble instrument of sowing the seeds of virtue in his heart. Nor was the generous-minded and philanthropic Colonel Grey forgotten, and with pleasure he looked forward to the moment when he should embrace the man who had first snatched his son from poverty, ignorance, and wretchedness. Chapter 13. Epigraph. As some lone miser visiting his store bends at his treasure, counts, recounts it o'er, thus to my breast alternate passions rise, pleased with each good that heaven to man supplies, yet oft a sigh prevails, and sorrows fall, to see the sum of human bliss so small. Goldsmith. The chief objection which struck Mr. Smith concerning his son's attachment to Miss Maudley was the large settlement for the marriage with Sir Sandy, while Mr. Freeman feared that our hero had forever forfeited her affections. The Oxford business, the source of the ills which followed, he supposed might be forgiven from the character the senior gave of her father, whose policy he was sure was the occasion of his resenting the blow more than any hatred or revenge. In his heart, I'm sure, said Mr. Smith, he applauded my son, for I had heard him confess that he was a lad of spirit, wished Sir Simeon had been like him, and could scarcely blame his daughter. He is fiery and high-spirited, said Mr. Maudley to me one day, and I took advantage of an unguarded moment to break off the connection, but I was obliged to fly away and let Sir Sandy tell his own tale. I'm afraid I would have relented as well as my daughter. Mr. Maudley's character is neither mercenary nor mean, but a London education, London manners, and London acquaintance, if he always lives in town or at some public place, have given him a distrust of strangers, an appearance of cunning very unlike his real character. And the method of his education, for he was an only son and brought up under a private tutor till the day of his marriage, has been a great misfortune to him. Mr. Maudley and Sir Sandy's father married the co-heiresses of Ralph Hopton, Esquire. At his death, both his daughters had been dead some years before. Not choosing his estate should be divided, he left it to Sir Sandy and Miss Maudley at their marriage at the age of 21 or sooner. If either died before that period, the estate was to devolve to the survivor, and if one of the parties thought proper to refuse the match, the whole estate went to the other. There was a clause also, for it was a most curious will, concerning fair and open dealings on both sides, honest and respectable behaviour, and many other little items, which I suppose, in the end, will furnish food for the lawyer unless Miss Maudley marries her cousin. You have known Mr. Maudley some time, I presume, said Mr. Freeman. Yes, replied the other, 25 years at least. I first became acquainted with him at Paris. He came there on account of a wager. A wager? You shall hear the particulars, which will give you the best insight to the character of the man. Mr. Maudley, I before said, had always lived a town life. When he was about the age of 30, some young men of fashion prevailed upon him to join his Majesty's staghounds, and betted him 50 guineas he was not in at the taking of the stag. Mr. Maudley, who was always a man of high spirits, accepted the wager, more through pique than will, and being well mounted, easily won it. After the chase, the company present were talking over the bet, and soon began, as is generally the case, to make others. Among many that took place, Mr. Maudley laid £500 that he rode the mare he had that day hunted with immediately to Paris and back again to England in the space of a week. The conditions were, Mr. Maudley was to go alone, and in the same dress, was to walk through the principal streets of Paris, which was specified, for at least 2 hours, and was to have no further assistance than 10 guineas and a few odd shillings he at that time had in his pocket. The bets were considerably against his doing it. At Paris, walking through the streets, he was so laughed at and ridiculed by the populace that his irritated fibres could no longer sustain his passion, and he struck a fellow who had long followed him with his whip. He was soon surrounded by the mob, and the guards had already begun to interfere when by accident I rode up. The strange figure at once surprised me. I was in the dress of my regiment, a captain of the guards, and inquired into the affair. He told me, in tolerable good French, he was an Englishman, that he had been insulted by the populace, and was sorry he had struck one of them with his whip. I soon released him from his troublesome company, and as he gave the offended some silver, they retired very well satisfied, and crying, Vive Milord Anglais! He returned me many thanks for my interference, and to my remark, which I could not fail making, that his strange dress was the occasion of the insult, he replied that it was on account of a wager, which wager prevented his more fully explaining his situation, but if ever I came to England, he should be happy to thank me in person. He then begged me to know to whom he had the honour to be so much obliged. I replied I proposed visiting England in the spring, and would wait for our mutual acquaintance till that period. We then parted. Mr. Maudley returned to England and won his wager. The following spring, I visited England, called upon Mr. Maudley, and our acquaintance has continued ever since. He has ever remained a steady and trusty friend, and it is to his care and management I am indebted for the excellent disposal of my small property. He has oftentimes tempted me to join in the bustle of the world. He has in the most liberal manner made me pecuniary offers, and had at one time signed a deed of gift of a small estate of his own near London, which my love for this retirement alone prevented my accepting. And from the well-known generosity of my friend, I cannot help thinking that it was Mr. Moodley who sent my son at different times the liberal supplies which you mentioned to me. This description of Mr. Moodley, so far different from what Mr. Freeman and Captain Smith had conceived, was not ungrateful to the parties. In a few days the three gentlemen set off on their visit to Colonel Grey, and arrived the second day to dinner. A great alteration and addition had been made to the house since our hero was here last. Mrs. Martha looked as blooming as ever. Abraham increased in wisdom as he increased in years. Dick was become more steady, and had followed his master's example in taking to himself a wife, and all parties received our hero and his friend with open arms. Brown, our hero's servant, accompanied them, and in him Dick soon recognised his younger brother. The colonel himself was as gay as ever, and looked so well and so young that very little difference was perceptible in himself and his bride, who was just turned of her 22nd year. The gentlemen were much pleased with Mrs. Grey, a very pretty brunette, easy and lively in her temper and manners, almost the counterpart of her husband. I omit the many kind things that passed between the gentlemen, and attempt not to describe which was most pleased with the other, the father of our hero, or the colonel, or the grateful pleasure Captain Smith experienced at the sight of his old friend. So fast does my history crowd upon me that I have passed by, for the present, even his old friend the Marquis of Derry. I must also omit, for the same reason, the joy of Miss Martha, Abraham, and Dick, the mutual inquiries of the latter and his new-found brother, the congratulations of all our hero's old acquaintance, and the description of Dick's young spouse, who had been Mrs. Grey's maid. But let me not forget to mention that Colonel Grey had lately received a letter from our hero's kinsman, Captain Willis, who had escaped from his confinement in France, and was every day expected at the colonel's. Before Captain Willis arrived, our hero was obliged to go to town according to his instructions from the commanding officer at sea, and when he returned to his friends, was received with open arms by his joyful relation. Now did the veteran remark what he had not perceived before, that his nephew was the very picture of his departed Nelly, and this melancholy remembrance reminded the gentleman of visiting her grave at Pitford. The day succeeding was appointed for to investigate the remaining proofs of our hero's birth, and to gain proper certificates that he was the son of the Duke de Merite. It was undoubtedly a very unpleasant business to Mr. Smith, Captain Willis, and our hero, but more so to the former. The idea that he was again to see his beloved wife, to see the now corrupted corpse of the woman he ever most truly loved, wrung with anguish for a while his whole frame. But reason pointed out to him his duty. Resolution once more took the command of his spirits, and though the lover and the husband felt and suffered, the man was determined and firm. Chapter 14. Epigraph. Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath? Can honour's voice break the silent dust, or flattery soothe the dull, cold ear of death? Grey. Our whole party, Colonel Grey, Mr. Freeman, Captain Willis, with our hero and his father, arrived at Pitford. They waited on the clergyman of the parish to ask permission to open the grave, which an old sexton pointed out to them, and the clergyman willingly consented, and with the churchwardens attended. As the company in silence surrounded the spot, the repository of the remains of the poor woman who was, above 20 years ago, buried from the inn, in spite of all that philosophy that had taught the senior Mr. Smith to condemn useless trophies and imaginary honours, he could not help beholding, with a sigh, the plain and simply turfed earth, where mixed with the common clay was deposited the beloved of his soul. The grave was opened, and with due care the mouldering boards which formed a coffin were lifted out. On the lid was inscribed the following: a poor woman unknown who died in childbirth of a son, May the 1st, 17. As they were about to open the coffin, the Duke, with laboured utterance, spoke. If a ring on the fourth finger of the deceased left hand, with the same instruction as this paper which I now present to the clergyman, the body is assuredly the remains of Eleanor Willis, daughter of Thomas Willis, Esquire, married in London, June 1st, 17, to the Marquis de Valois, eldest son of the Duc de Meride, a peer of France. The corpse was now uncovered. The form, the features as yet remained. It is my Nelly, cried the agonized husband, and nearly sunk upon the ground, supported by his son. It is indeed, repeated the veteran Captain Willis. In a moment the Duke roused his agitated spirits and approached the well-known form. He reached out his hand, he took hold of the ring, easily it came off, and the finger perished by the touch. It was the same ring, still perfect. He handed it to the company, all examined it and saw the inscription. The features at first so visible were already gone. The clean linen cloth was laid over the fast mouldering clay, and it was again deposited in its place of rest. Every circumstance was noted. Every attestation was taken, signed, and witnessed immediately, that the shadow of a doubt might not remain, but that John Smith, captain in His Majesty's troop of light horse, was the son of Clement, Marquis de Valois, and Eleanor Willis, and lawful heir to the castle of St. Donat's. With the authentic proofs of the birth, family, and identity of our hero, Captain Willis left his friends to wait on Sir J. Morgan, who the public papers informed was lately arrived at Portsmouth after a very successful cruise. One morning, Colonel Grey informed his visitors that on the following day there would be a ball at the nearest country town, and asked them if they had any objection to going. No one had the least. The colonel promised our hero the honour of dancing with his lady, and assured the other gentlemen if they chose to dance he would provide them with partners. Mr. Smith pleaded his wound as an excuse. Mr. Freeman said he should only dance through necessity, and the colonel had no one to cater for but himself. The company arrived after 7, and began country dances almost immediately. Captain Smith and Mrs. Grey danced down the first dance, and were standing at the bottom, our hero opposite the door. It opened, and a gentleman handed the lady into the room. The youth choked. The colour fled from his face. He withdrew his eyes, but in a moment they were riveted to the object. It was, indeed, his never-to-be-forgotten Eliza. Her father followed her with Mrs. Herriot and another lady. Our hero's colour now rose so violently Mrs. Grey could not fail remarking it. "You know the party that has just entered?" Yes, ma'am," stammered the youth. "Oh, she is a beautiful creature," added Mrs. Grey archly, "and as an old acquaintance you may like to dance with her. Remember, I am a married woman, and will resign you." "Indeed, ma'am," said our hero, scarcely knowing what he said, "I have no such hopes, no such intentions." "Well," continued Mrs. Grey, who saw he was very much confused, "do as you like. Mr. Freeman, I know, will take pity on me. So you are your own master." Mr. Smith, senior, who was standing by the fireplace with Mr. Freeman and observing the company, saw Mr. Moodley and his party the moment they entered. Uncertain how he should act concerning introducing his son, he was retiring for the present when Mr. Moodley perceived him. With the eagerness of an old friend, being very much surprised, he came directly to him, and with great cordiality professed his joy at seeing him once more in public. Mr. Smith led him aside, mentioning that he had something particular to say to him. "You are astonished, my good friend, to see me here." "I am, I assure you. I had a great deal to say to you, but at present you must be satisfied with the head and ask no questions. First, my name is Smith." "How, Mr. Smith? Why so?" "You begin already. You must retire unless you promise to wait another time for all explanations." "Well, I will wait. I have discovered a son." "A son? Impossible! How?" "Again, I have undoubted proofs of the truth. Child of my dear Nelly." The tone in which the husband spoke the last words as he wiped the tear from his eye checked the hastiness of Mr. Moodley. He felt for his friend at the remembrance of his loss. Mr. Smith continued, "This son is now in the room. I am afraid he is under your displeasure." Mr. Moodley was alarmed and greatly confused. "Well, which, my dear friend, is the young man?" "He is almost at the top of the dance. Look, do you see any you recollect?" "Yes," said Mr. Moodley, much affected. "I do. I see one who I have grossly ill-used. I am all amazement, but I'll ask no questions at present. Let me congratulate you in having such a son. I am not ignorant of his courage and conduct abroad." "Shall I introduce him?" "With the utmost pleasure." Mr. Smith went towards his son. He brought him to Mr. Moodley. "My son, Mr. Moodley." Mr. Moodley seized him by the hand. He could not speak, but taking his handkerchief from his pocket with his left hand, he put it to his face and turning his head aside, still grasped his hand. This affecting silence was more eloquent than words, and far more grateful to our hero. 1,000 pleasant thoughts hovered around him, and hope, joyful hope, once more fluttered in the group. Miss Maudley, in the meantime, was no indifferent spectator of what was going forward. She had recognised our hero the instant she had entered the room. Their eyes had met, and clearly spoke. Captain Smith, no longer the bold and presuming lover, had fared even to address the fair object. He stood trembling in suspense, dreading a repulse if he spoke, uncertain and suspicious of the gentleman who handed her into the room, whether he might not be a favoured lover, or still more favoured husband. The last thought curdled his blood, and how many aerial phantoms of jealousy the magician love would soon have raised up. To confirm it, I will not pretend to determine, had not his father at the moment changed the course of his ideas by introducing him to Mr. Maudley. Miss Maudley at the further end of the room could perceive just sufficient to be the subject of alarm to her. Twice did she rise from her seat, fearful for her father, and twice, as she saw no reason for her alarms, did she think proper to sit down again. Although Mr. Maudley broke silence to our hero, at length Mr. Maudley broke silence to our hero. Captain Smith, I wish to apologise to you for the seeming hauteur and incivility with which I have ever treated you. I thought it necessary for the future peace of both parties that no intimacy should take place between us. For this reason, I endeavoured to chill the acquaintance at the beginning. I magnified the affair at Oxford, and took that opportunity to break off the acquaintance, though I was conscious the apologies you offered were more than adequate to the offence. Our hero attempted to say something civil in return, but so broken, so unconnected with the sentences, I shall willingly pass them over. Suffice it to say, Mr. Maudley took their meaning, shook him again warmly by the hand, and offered to introduce him to his sister and daughter. Who now so blessed as our hero? Yet the physiognomist must have been above the common sort that could have perceived one grain of pleasure in his countenance. He turned pale as he faintly told Mr. Maudley he should be happy with the honour. Not that our hero was so diffident and mistrustful of himself, but he could not forget the disgraceful scenes Miss Maudley had been a witness of, both at the playhouse and at Ranelagh. His connection with Mrs. Chervil had not been transitory. He had publicly as well as privately lived with that lady for many months, and had even left the kingdom in her company, and been seen with her afterwards in the most familiar manner, by the last person he would have wished a witness to his degeneracy. How did Miss Maudley know this connection did not still remain, or at least that he had not formed others of the same nature? A young woman of Miss Maudley's clear good sense was one of the last to support any man. I suppose any man could possibly be the better for being a rake. Reformed rakes make the best husbands, says the old proverb. I cannot but think most old proverbs speak something like the truth, though, like all the wise sayings and speeches of the ancients, they are sometimes enveloped in mysteries, allegories, and figures. Let us remember the proverb does not pretend to say that reformed rakes make the best lovers, and then, by reviewing the qualifications of what are called good husbands, we shall probably come to the truth. Reader, art thou interested in the decision? Art thou uninterested in the decision? Skip to the next chapter. If the husband is civil, quiet, and easy, and permits the will of his wife to be in general his own, few women would probably in public call him a bad one, and all the world, that is, everybody who does not intimately know him, will undoubtedly call him a good one. A person whose manhood is in full vigour, fresh, perfect, undebilitated, unsated, will be more likely to prove a fit antagonist for the wiles and stratagems, tricks, and fancies of the female, than the youth of the world, who, having long exercised his androical powers from the use even to the abuse of them, is no longer to be quickened with novelty, but begins already to feel that human nature is imperfect, weak, and easily cloyed. To make up for this deficiency is the least thing the latter can do. He therefore takes care to be civil, quiet, and easy, and thus by this prudent behaviour he at once attains the character of a good husband, while the other, who is conscious of no deficiency himself, has no need of making any allowances, but carries his rule over the weaker part with a high hand, is often rude, restless, and violent, has a will of his own, and makes that will a law, and therefore to the misjudging world bears not the outward semblance of goodness so much as the other. The elucidating verbosity of a Johnsonian might more systematically accelerate this explication. A cogitation of the deficiency of the animal powers, such a one would say, by a defalcation of the generative faculty would, but I am unequal to the language. Fair maidens, lovely heiresses, am I understood? Will you deign to hear a tale to the purpose? A young fellow with no other knowledge in horseflesh than clear good sense can give went once upon a time to a large fair to purchase himself a horse, determined to buy the best that he could meet with. A crowd of dealers and sellers soon surrounded him. This horse, says one, man, showing the animal, is the famous old Nick, which carried Lord Rattlebane last season, and is so well known in the Duke's hunt. Well, this, sir, says another, is the famous trotting mare. She has trotted 16 miles within the hour and beat Sir Harry's boy for 100 guineas. Here, says a third, is the house of horses that went from London to Brighton in 6 hours. Oh, see my bit of blood, cries a fourth. This won the sweepstakes last year at Epsom. Well, my friend, says our would-be purchaser to a countryman who led a young stallion pouring along the ground, what have you to say for yours? Oh, and please, your honour, she's a skittish young thing, I must confess, but of a deadly good breed. Hasn't done much work yet, to be sure, but he's sound, goes well enough in all his paces. Sure, growled the jockeys at once. Who'd give anything for a young thing that nobody knows? Gentlemen, replied the stranger, who wanted a horse, have you any particular fault to find with the farmer's young stallion? No, replied the gentleman's jockeys, but it is an untried creature. A mere colt. Where's his character? Where's his goodness? What has he done? Gentlemen, said the intended purchaser again, I am indeed looking for a good horse. I like hard riding. I should have no objection to trot 16 miles within the hour, gallop 20, win a sweepstakes, or ride with the foremost hounds in a fox chase. Your most excellent, most capital horses have already done all this. This young thing will, I make no doubt, be able to do the same whenever it becomes necessary. Such good things I like to have in store, and if I may judge from appearances, gentlemen, from the present state of the flesh, bones, and muscle of all your horses, this young colt is at present most equal to these kind of tasks. So here, my friend, to the countryman, is your 30 guineas, and if any one of the present good company dislikes my purchase, I can only say that I have 20 good miles home to the noble city of York, and will lay down 100 guineas with him that I am there upon my young stallion before either the trotter, the galloper, the hunter, or the racer. The respectable jockeys turned upon their heels, and the purchaser, mounting his new horse, rode coolly away. Attend, maidens all, to this plain tale of mine, and when the young rake, old in the knowledge of the world, tempts you to the Gretna Green trip, remember that they reformed rakes are said to be the best husbands, as horses which have done great feats are called the best horses. Consider for one moment whether you had not better make your choice according to the principle of my late purchaser. Chapter 15, Epigraph. As oft the sick in dreams attempt to fly, what time the fainting limbs their aid deny, in vain their lips a vocal sound essay, nor cries nor voice can find their wonted way. Tasso's Jerusalem. The whole account of our hero's imprudence, to make use of the fashionable term for vice, the sweet girl had been most carefully informed of before he went abroad. Of his professional conduct while in the service, all the public prints had spoken full loud and favourable to anyone to be ignorant, while the quick ear of love had caught hold of many things concerning his private history, none of which were ungrateful to a female ear. Among many other opportunities which the lady met with, I shall mention one. Who is this Captain Smith? Said Miss Maudley one day to an officer who had lately arrived from the Cape, and was a relation of her father's, of whom we have heard so much lately for his conduct in boarding the pirate and at the Cape. Oh, he's a captain, ma'am, replied the officer, of the regiment. As fine a young man as ever I saw. I am totally unacquainted of what family, but he is very much respected in the army. A dashing young hero, said the lady, affecting to smile with indifference. Man of the world, I suppose. No doubt a great favourite of our sex. I believe, ma'am, he would be not a little so, were he inclined to try his fortune that way. But he is possessed with a settled melancholy. He has no particular acquaintance either among the officers or the ladies, and all the times he can spare from the duties of his profession, to which he tenaciously adheres, is unwearingly spent in study. It is in vain we tempt him to stay with us at the mess. The forms of respectable civility alone induce him to dine with us, and to stay a few hours. Melancholy people in general, said Miss Maudley questioningly, are said to fly to the bottle as an opiate for their cares. Well, this is not Captain Smith's case. He is rather too abstemious, and once, when very earnestly pressed to drink his glass, he made a most remarkable reply to the chairman, which I shall never forget. May I trouble you to repeat it, sir? I should be a most ungrateful fellow, said Captain Smith, addressing himself to the senior officer, if after the favours and attentions I have received from yourself and my brother officers, I should in any degree interrupt the harmony and conviviality of the company, and I will take this opportunity to apologise and somewhat account for the unsociableness of my disposition, which you must all gentlemen too often have remarked. The President politely said that there was no need of any apology, and begged he would do as he pleased. Captain Smith, with a bow, continued. The curiosity of the company was greatly excited. By following the common course of dissipation to which we were all so exposed, by my own unguarded folly and want of resolution in trifles, I brought upon myself a long series of misfortunes which, but for one friendly hand, had hurried me on the disgraceful and miserable end of a suicide. My health and my pecuniary credit first fell the sacrifices. The fond partiality of my friends was deceived. Conscious that I did not deserve, I no longer sought their protection. To complete my ruin, I received a double blow in the most trying points, my love and my honour. The former is too tender a subject for me to say more upon. The rankling weapon still lies fixed there. Captain Smith smote his breast, paused for a moment, and then, well, with a forced smile, he added, To your kindness I am indebted for the recovery of the latter. The gentleman was here interrupted in his tale by the appearance of Miss Modeley, who, with a face as white as the fabled spectre of the dead, seemed ready to sink into the ground. Well, your sensibility, my dear madam, the officer, greatly affects you, and you'll permit me to give you a glass of water? The young lady soon recollected, and soon recovered herself, and now looked more like the crimson rose, faintly begged the gentleman to proceed. Well, Captain Smith, he replied, thus finished his speech. It is from this situation of my mind, gentlemen, the baneful remains of which can never be removed, that I fear the consequences of the least indulgent to my passions, more particularly in that of drinking, as I have reason to dread the effects it may have upon my already so violently convulsed frame, and I again avoid it on another account, lest I should be induced to use it as a temporary, though poisonous requiem for my grief, and thus slowly perpetuate the crime I was once so strongly tempted to rush headlong upon. To attempt, madam, to describe to you the effect this speech had upon the company, delivered in the most manly and resolute, though civil and mild terms, I am unequal. Captain Smith, as soon as he had finished, filled his glass to the brim, drank to all the company, and retired. Miss Modeley, with her eyes fixed upon the ground, had thought for some time that he had too far indulged her curiosity, and as an excuse she said, I have no doubt, sir, you have already supposed that I know the gentleman we've been talking of, which will account to you for the agitation I showed, and my curiosity concerning him. He once protected me, at the hazard of his own life, from the dreadful plot of a designing villain, and happily, afterwards he offended my father, who has desired his name never to be mentioned before him. It is unnecessary to say the gentleman took the hint conveyed in the last words. They also explained to him a few other matters concerning his cousin's former attachment, which he had slightly heard mentioned, and also the young captain's love melancholy. Miss Modeley, on her part, though so very much affected with the story, in the whole found a vast deal more to approve of than condemn. This digression will account for the young lady's knowledge of the alteration and reformation which had taken place in our hero. Let us now return to the assembly room. Mr. Modeley walked down the room with the father and son, gently holding the arm of the young captain. Having introduced them to Mrs. Herriot, they passed on to the younger lady. The astonished daughter could scarcely believe the scene before her. Her senses were confused and bewildered. She would have arisen from her seat, but, like a person in a dream, her feet seemed to have lost their office. Your father, my dear girl, said Mr. Modeley, pointedly, presents to you an old acquaintance, Captain Smith. You'll be surprised to hear he is the son of this my most respectable friend, and henceforth Mr. Smith. Mr. Modeley knew the father, and she politely bowed, faintly perhaps, to the captain, yet not without a willing smile, which was visible to every eye, except that of a timid lover. Our hero, but this is the description which, though my mind can rapturously feel, my pen is unequal to explain. Let it suffice the reader that if he has been conversant in novels, he has doubtless read many excellent scenes of this kind. If not, I will not so prejudice him against that species of composition as to coarsely develop such delicate sensations known only to the uninitiated, lest, like the brute who attempts to spin, I do but tear the materials. Captain Smith, even 10 times more confused than when he addressed the father, summoned up courage to express the pleasure the introduction had afforded him. The fathers left them together, and Mr. Smith made Mr. Modeley acquainted with the Colonel Grey and his lady. Mr. Freeman, the gentleman and the lady who entered the room along with Mr. Modeley and his daughter, were near neighbours, and well known to the Colonel. The two parties, therefore, were soon joined together. After the delicate feelings of our hero had a little subsided, he said, You're in this part of the country, Miss Modeley? Yes, sir, we're with the gentleman and lady who entered the room with us. A pause. You came here very late for a country assembly. Don't you dance? Oh, sorry. You came here very late for a country assembly. Don't you dance? Then next, I think, with Mr. Clover. Another pause, longer than the former, ensued, and the music striking up for the dance, Miss Moodley said, "Your partner, I believe, is waiting for you, Captain Smith." Does Miss Moodley wish me gone so soon? Oh, Eliza, will not years of penitence and remorse entitle me to be ranked among your acquaintance? Am I really an object of hatred? Is the very sight of me become offensive? If so, speak the word. This wretch shall never more appear before you. Good God, Mr. Smith, said the young lady, why do you talk thus? You alarm me. Pray consider where we are. She would not willingly distress me. I hate you indeed. Gratitude alone will. Pardon me, my ever dear Miss Moodley. Once more, pardon the warmth of a man who, whatever may have been his crimes, has never for a moment forgotten. You must excuse me, rejoined the fair damsel with a smile, for again hastening you away. You see, your partner is walking to the top of the dance with my intended, and we are both concerned to prevent it. This was said in so very different a tone from anything that had before passed, the love-entangled captain felt an unusual throb of pleasure vibrate through his frame. May I hope, said he, taking the hand of his beloved object, may I presume to hope that Miss Moodley, instead of sending me on so ungrateful an errand, will aid to revenge it by retaliation? Well, when I am really satisfied of the treachery of my partner, I don't know what revenge will prompt me to do, but let us wait a little till we are certain that we are forsaken. It will then be time enough. Miss Moodley, who was as yet ignorant concerning the lady that Smith had been dancing with, was not sorry to perceive that whoever she was, she had evidently no strong hold upon his heart. But I think, continued the fair lady, though I have such good reason to complain of the neglect of my partner, you have very little of yours. She is a very pretty woman. You ought to make one attempt to recover her before it is too late. After Miss Moodley has flattered me that I shall be the partner of her revenge, I shall remain steady at my present post. Mrs. Grey, I know, will excuse me. Miss Moodley was not sorry to hear the lady was wife to the colonel. His friendship and patronage of Smith she had frequently in former times been told by her hero himself, and lately she had heard of his marriage and residence in the country from her friends the Clovers. Mr. Clover and Mrs. Grey now came down the dance. They gave a significant nod at our young couple, and Miss Moodley no longer made any objection to joining the dances with our hero. I shall pass over the rest of the occurrences of this evening with simply remarking that everything concluded with the utmost harmony. The specimen of the conversation of lovers which I have literally given shows how uninteresting is such discourse to any but themselves. They formed one party at the tea-table. Colonel Grey was in a high flow of spirits, and rattled away with his usual carelessness and success. Freeman, more temperate in his joy, did not betray it so much by his words as by the expanding countenance and glistening eye of a susceptible heart. The more elderly gentlemen laughed more than they talked. The ladies seemed mutually pleased with one another, and our hero had much more the appearance of resignation of a captive than the hauteur of a conqueror. Before they separated, Mr. Clover invited Colonel Grey and his friends to dinner on the following day, which was willingly agreed by all. The portion of sleep which each of the lovers lost on that ever memorable night, it is proper I should remark, was amply made up by the enlargement to the stock of felicity which their wakeful thoughts offered them. And as her handmaid's health, youth, and beauty attended Miss Moodley in the morning, hope in the form of our hero threw a tinge on her countenance, which had, for a long time, been banished from her cheeks. Chapter 16. Epigraph. Now the brisk clouds in airy tumults fly. The sun emerging opes another sky, a fresher green the smelling leaves display, and glittering as they tremble, cheer the day. Parnell. Before I proceed in my history, I shall briefly explain the final cause of Sir Sandy Simeon Swain's dismissal. A few days prior to Miss Moodley's being of age, Sir Sandy, who doubted the determination of the young lady, was resolved to ensure success by putting into the various papers the paragraph we have formerly mentioned. This Sir Sandy concluded would fix his wavering hopes. But Miss Moodley was a woman of too good sense to be the victim of vulgar opinion, and with her usual clear judgment instantly guessed at the author. She was not long in deciding how to act, but applied to an eminent attorney, a man of tried respectability and character, and a friend of her father's. The gentleman soon compelled the printer to give up the name of Sir Sandy, and Mr. Modley was so offended at the meanness of his conduct that he immediately forbade him his house. Miss Modley now, by the advice of her attorney, claimed her right to the property, alleging that contrary to the tenor of her grandfather's will, Sir Sandy had been guilty of unfair and dishonest behaviour. The affair was at present in Chancery. The morning after the ball, as soon as the breakfast was over at Mr. Clover's, Mr. Modley, taking his daughter's arm with the fond appreciation of a parent under his, led her to a retired walk not far from the house, and thus addressed her. Your duty and affection for your father, my dear girl, has ever been the boasted comfort of my life, and I trust you will not accuse your father of much harshness or severity, and will forgive— Talk not to my beloved father, said the amiable daughter, of my forgiveness or of your harshness and severity. You have always been my protecting angel, and the care and trouble you have had on my account must have embittered many precious moments of your life. Well, my dear Eliza, replied Mr. Modley, we will say no more of this, but it is proper you should know now, in justification of the son of my friend, that his conduct towards me at Oxford was very different from what was imposed upon you and your aunt. With Sir Sandy's character you are thoroughly acquainted. The other chief informer is an envious wretch of a different cast, though equally as unworthy of credit as the former. The supposed blow I received from Captain Smith was purposely provoked by me. In truth, it was not properly a blow, as it was with his open hand he pushed me from him. I have never borne him one moment's anger for the deed, but in my own heart I should have condemned him had he behaved otherwise. From the very first time I saw Captain Smith, when he had rescued us from villains, I saw the danger that was to be apprehended from an acquaintance with so engaging a youth, where gratitude had laid the foundation. I endeavoured to crush it in the bud. I put on an appearance of ingratitude, very far from my feelings, and seeing no means of your escaping the connection with Sir Sandy, I considered what I did as my duty both as your parent and guardian. Dear sir, do not excuse your conduct to me. You can do no wrong, I'm sure. You must not interrupt me, my love. I shall soon have finished. I, from the first acquaintance, made inquiries concerning your protector. I found he was portionless and fatherless, with a few friends who had more the will than means to greatly serve him. Pecuniary supplies, I thought, would not be disagreeable, and from time to time I privately supplied him with small sums, as his occasions seemed to require them, without his ever knowing the hand from whom they came. Thus, in some measure, I made atonement to my conscience for the ingratitude I had been guilty of. The dissipated life he afterwards lived, of which you yourself have been the witness, I fear disappointment and despair hurried him into. I have no manner of doubt at present that he is both conscious of his former follies, and has bravely thrown them aside. The officers who were with him at the Cape, many of whom I intimately know, speak of him as well for his moral as his military conduct. All my objections then are vanished, every obstacle is gone, and if my Eliza still beholds him with the same eyes, the consent of her father shall no longer be wanting. The notes of Mr. Modley were in perfect unison with the sensations of his charming daughter, and were I master of music, I would here enlarge my metaphor with the proper application of concords and discords, etc., etc., till I had flattered myself that I had worked the reader also to a proper tune. But as it is, he must be satisfied with a simple continuation of my tale. Pass me over the dinner and the almost rudeness of our hero in flying from the battle to join his beloved mistress, whom he saw from the window, walking with the other ladies in the garden. Full 5 long minutes did he continue in his chair after he saw them. 10 times had he answered wrong as many questions without knowing what was said to him. Smith, said his friend Freeman archly, you look faint. A turn in the garden, I think, would cool and recover you. Not for the world, said Colonel Grey. 'Twill but inflame the poor fellow the more. Nobody a good long story to tell him to turn the course of his thoughts. Well, I'm afraid his senses are affected, continued Freeman. I remark he hears imperfectly, and speaks very incoherently. Well, he looks wildly too, added the Colonel. Well, there's a fine orange upon his plate untouched. I doubt if he can smell. I would some fair lady were to give him a pinch. We should then know if he can feel. I remember, said our hero, pretending to look grave, it was a maxim of Marshall, when your assailants prove too powerful, make your retreat as soon as possible. To such authority I must submit. So saying, he hastened out of the room and joined the ladies in the garden. The married ladies, acting according to the good old Christian maxim, soon left Captain Smith and Miss Modley alone. Opportunity was seldom lost upon our hero, ever inclined to seize old time by his forelock. The only difference now was that he took his hold with more care and prudence, and therefore was more likely to retain him. The violent lover who had before poured forth vows of everlasting love and constancy without thought or reason, at present timid but equally firm and true, gradually and clearly unravelled his whole soul to his adored mistress. Think not, my ever dear Eliza, continued he, that I will offer any excuse for my former ill conduct. But, oh, believe me, that in whatever situation I have been, one smile from you could at once have commanded me. I love you, and never any so well as you. May I hope you have not forgotten your former kindness and will forgive my... It is one of the most difficult things for a true lover to finish his speech well. Miss Moodley, duly considering this, darted so kind a glance at the prostrate youth that she quickly changed the course of his oratory. Do I look, said she, as if I had forgotten and could not forgive? The captain waited for no more, but sealed the candid confession with the warm kiss of love. To the profusion of an enraptured mind which our hero poured forth, Miss Moodley, with her looks upon the ground, replied, To see you once more safe returned, to find you are again the same I first gave my vows to hear you are approved of by my father. Need I say more? No, 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 cried the youth, half mad with joy. My most charming, most constant Eliza, you are alone the same, thus ever merciful, true, and sincere. Oh, how shall I repay? My dear Mr. Smith, said the charming girl, hush, be moderate. See, our fathers are coming toward us. Mr. Smith Senior and Mr. Moodley came up and joined those hands whose hearts had been so long united. Chapter 17, Epigraph. Liberal, not lavish, is kind nature's hand, nor was perfection made for man below. Yet all her schemes which with nicest art are planned, good counteracting ill, and gladness woe. The Minstrel. With the consent and approbation of all parties, Miss Moodley considered our hero as her future husband. Nor was the time far distant, they waited but the necessary adjustment of the lawyers. Mr. Moodley, Mrs. Harriet, and his daughter left Mr. Clover's for Mr. Moodley's house in town, where, lodgings having been before prepared, our hero, his father, and Mr. Freeman were to meet Captain Willis. The captain soon returned from Portsmouth. Sir J. Morgan willingly resigned the St. Donat's estate, which Mr. Smith insisted upon giving up to his son on his marriage. A few days before the celebration, Captain Smith was agreeably surprised to meet his old friend Whiffle in Bond Street. The moment Whiffle saw our hero, he drew up his head, and to Smith's warm salutation, "Oh, Whiffle, I'm extremely glad to see you," replied with the studied bow of a dancing master. "You're more obedient, Mr. Smith. I beg your pardon, Captain Smith. Have you been long in the metropolis? You were with our armies, I think, at the Cape. How go on your affairs there? Can I be of any service to you? I beg you will command me. Immediately happy to serve an old friend. You may depend upon every exertion in my power for your promotion." "Hey day," said our hero, laughing. "I'm all in a mist." "Now, it is extremely hard," said Whiffle, stifling a laugh, "that a member of Parliament, a courtier, must be the trumpeter of his own honours." "A member of Parliament and courtier?" retorted our hero with surprise. "Well, even so, my good friend," said Whiffle, resuming his old way, "and since I have given you a specimen of true parliamentary language out of doors, I hope you will give me the credit that I shall do very well within. At present, I will divest myself of the new-made honours, and tell you how extremely glad I am to see you again in England. Though I must say, you should have offered to my honourable person a little bit of the incense of flattery." "Well, most august senator," began our hero, "pride of thy country, terror of its enemies, glory of the realm, brightest jewel of the crown, and guardian angel of the people's rights." Very well, said Whiffle. You begin right enough. I'll excuse you the rest till some other time. Now, if you're not better employed, I'll take a turn with you in the park and give you the history of these, my blushing honours. Our hero consented. Whiffle took his arm, and as they walked, thus began. "The source of my greatness is your old acquaintance Sims." "Ah, I've heard he has a borough. Is he in town?" "He will be tomorrow. I shall be very glad to see him. He is, I suppose, the other member." "Yes, Sims, you know, was a man of few words, which perhaps has been the occasion of our intimacy, as I generally make up for the number for both. He asked me last year to accompany him into Devonshire, where he was going to take possession of the largest estate that was left him. All the neighbourhood came to pay their compliments to a man of his consequence and property in the country. Among others, the two members for Simsborough waited upon. It was very well known that there was to be a new Parliament the following year, and they were in hopes that Sims, whose abilities they had a very low opinion of, would permit them to retain their seats. The Honourable Mr. Lascaux, Lord Ladyacre's son, one of the members, is a complete courtier. He bowed, smiled, assented, and played off all his courtly graces to gain the patronage of the great man Sims. The other, Colonel Sandfire, an excellent soldier in the House of Commons, affects the manners of an experienced warrior, speaks with a plausible confidence on most subjects, and prides himself not a little on his oratory. Well, everything was said and done by the two gentlemen that might ingratiate themselves with their patron, who made little reply, but seemed wrapped in attention of their judicious remarks, polite flattery, and experimental knowledge of the great things going forward in the country. The comical turn of the two characters soon set my tongue a-going. I asked the sapient gents a few odd questions, which confused and astonished the courtier, and nonplussed not a little the military operator. The soldier, you must know, has never been out of England, but 3 months in his life, 10 weeks of which were passed away upon the blank seas. Yet he is ever talking of his personal knowledge of the strength and situation of every fortress and port in Europe. I had been looking at a large map that morning, which hung in the library, to find the route of the French fleet after Lord Glorious Victory. It easily puzzled his geographical knowledge. I dealt with the other, an affirmative animal, after the clue which Hamlet had given me in his riddle of ostrich. I rather suspect that they thought at last I was laughing at them, but they had treated me so cavalierly, had seemed so certain of our raw ignorance, and the colonel had given such confounded specimens of the knowing traveller that I could not possibly resist the temptation. "What think you, Whiffle," said Sims to me after their departure, "of my members of Parliament?" "Well, I think, Sims," said I, "you've had my opinion pretty freely already." "Well, as for that honourable Mr. Lascaux," said Sims, "I'll prove as good a senator as him in 2 minutes. I need not describe to you, Smith, how well Sims immediately took him off, after we had laughed our fill. "Now, Whiffle," continued he, "I flatter myself you can make as good an orator as the colonel, and since my country will not be injured by the exchange, what say you for giving up all thoughts of the archbishopric and aiding me in giving laws to our country?" "Well, you are certainly not in earnest," said I, "for I have no such thoughts." "I was never more in earnest," replied Sims. "I hate long speeches, but upon my life, if you'll accept of one seat at the next election, it is at your service, and will divide the fatigue of the borough betwixt us." I believe I was greatly obliged to Sims for this proof of his friendship. I had little inclination, and was still less fit for the church, which my uncle was much determined on, and I must have preached with an ill will and worse grace, or starved at once, but for this offer of Sims. "You have a seat in the House of Commons," said our hero, "but are you on that account furnished with food and clothing?" "I need not give you a direct answer to your question," replied Whiffle, "when I inform you the minister has thought proper to offer me a post under government, which my will, as well as my poverty, induced me to accept." Smith smiled. "Nay," continued Whiffle, interpreting the smile, "I've had offers too from the other side. Did you remark that dark, ill-looking man that bowed me a few moments ago?" "Yes," replied Smith. "Well," continued Whiffle, "he called upon me the other morning with liberal offers from the opposition. He's a furious friend of the people of virtue, of humanity. I'll give you a slight sketch, as he happens to be a brother soldier. He is in the army, member for, chosen by the great interest of his family, capital merchants in the slave trade, and the present war is the bane of this honourable traffic, therefore the humane will declaim for many a long hour on the miseries of war and the invaluable blessings of peace, or perhaps on the morrow he will talk on the comforts of slavery and sneer at the laudable endeavours of those who attempt to abolish that cruel and inhuman commerce, which drags the innocent negro from his home, which sells him as a beast of burden and compels him to work to the utmost with whips and tortures at the will of a selfish master. These are the wretches," said our hero with indignation, "that throw a blemish on the honourable name of patriot. To hear such a one cry out upon the praise of humanity, justice, and liberty makes the very name of virtue suspected and feared. And yet this very man Smith, in the late American War, made it his boast that he had destroyed numbers of the unarmed natives. He rode out in the morning to the slaughter, in the evening gloried in the massacres he had perpetrated. When I see such as these, the leaders of a party, the vociferating reformers of the kingdom, with words of honey on their tongue and bitter gall in their hearts, I lay no burden on my conscience in accepting the offers of the great man. Besides, let me inform you that I am no idle pensioner, but regularly attend in my office 3 days in the week, from 12 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon." "Well, my dear fellow," said our hero, "I heartily congratulate you. Though we may not exactly agree in politics, I'm very happy in hearing this favourable account. But where are your jibes and your jests, which were once to set our Oxford table in a roar? All given up? Not one pun left?" "I wish they had left me before. cried he. I've been practising to speak without that ornament ever since I made my initiating speech at the election, and, assuming a grave tone, I assure you, that ridiculous habit was become so common, I was obliged to write down my speech and afterwards get it by heart. And with all my care, I blundered on a fine string at the end. Do favour me with them. No, upon my honour. My dear Whiffle, me, your old friend, Smith. I'm quite ashamed. I've repented it ever since, but I was tempted by the huzzas of the populace to lengthen my speech beyond the writing, and spoiled it all. Pray let me have it. You'll greatly oblige me. Well then, murmured Whiffle, there was a great cry of your principles. And I replied, the principles of all my principles, gentlemen, is the welfare of my country. Next, I am a staunch advocate for the support of our fleet, for I look upon it as our support. Though I profess myself no friend to a large standing army, I trust the British soldiers will ever keep firm their ground. I glory too in the rights of man, but think no one has a right to be a villain. I respect the laws of equality, but never be taught them by a Frenchman, or aid him in gaining an equality here. Do you inquire if I am a ministerialist? Yes, if I can minister to the wants of my country. Am I as oppositionist? Undoubtedly, against its errors, its crimes, and its vices. The first place I am anxious for is a seat you can grant me. The only pension on the civil lift I require is the glorious pension of peace. For you, for me, for all my countrymen. Do not besnake me, gentlemen. Though my intention is peaceable, I mean also an able peace, not the base submission of a conquered nation, but such rights, such indemnifications, such securities as a free, a brave, a generous people may demand. Well, Whiffle, said Smith, if there was any harm in your puns, you made up for them in your concluding sentiment. But I should conceive that they were not lost on the multitude. No, cried Whiffle. They seemed to make their way more grateful than grating. Even compared my oratory to a famous Methodist preacher's in those parts, which is the best lecture I ever had upon punning. But see, who comes here? As I live, 'tis that whetstone of wit, but of ridicule, echo of folly. Like a drum, he is hollow and empty, of no manner of use, unless someone is playing upon him. The nymph Wonder, what superb fine lady has he got under his arm? Marmaduke, your most obedient. Oh, Captain Smith, mon cher ami, escaped the old conquering French. Mr. Whiffle, how do you do? Give me leave to present to you both Mrs. Marmaduke Pendragon. Whiffle and our hero made their obeisance and looked at one another with some surprise. Our hero addressed them. I have not had the pleasure of hearing of your happiness before, Mr. Marmaduke, but it is with the greatest satisfaction I congratulate you, and with Mrs. M. Pendragon and yourself, and wish Mrs. M. Pendragon and yourself joy upon this occasion. May I ask, said Whiffle, assuming his new character of the courtier, from what period you date the era of your connubial felicity? Oh, said Marmaduke, guessing at the meaning of the inquiry, I've been married about an English week. I presume, replied Whiffle, you compute your time by decades. If 4 of them make the month, you'll have a honeymoon in your favour. Marmaduke was at a loss what to answer. Our hero jogged Whiffle, and luckily prevented some wicked question just coming out. Yet Whiffle, in defiance of our hero, could not forbear a parting sentiment. Good morning, Marmaduke, said he, and I hope when we meet next to congratulate you on a radical reform, since you have had the happiness to meet with so fair a representative. Whether Mrs. Pendragon had read Lord Chesterfield, I cannot say, but she showed the spirit of that fashionable author and took Mr. Whiffle's speech in the light of a compliment. Exchanging addresses, they separated, and Smith and the Member of Parliament continued their walk. So, says Whiffle, our political antagonist has succeeded in part, and I might have given him joy of having obtained a lasting peace. But to whom, in the name of wonder, can this Marmaduke be married? We shall soon see somebody to inquire of, replied Smith. Oh, yonder is La Pauper, cried Whiffle, a wretch who has so little worth of his own that he endeavours to borrow some by using the name, and knowing the history of all others. May scum on the pot of greatness, froth and frothy, with nothing left of the savour but the stink. The red book is his law, philosophy and divinity. I am certain he has seen the new edition and heard of my preferment. He will soon join us. What, has he forgiven you the Vauxhall trick? Oh, that's of no import. His forgiveness and his revenge are both measured by a man's consequence. He is a perfect shadow of other men's greatness. Good morning, Mr. La Pauper. I hope Lady Amelia is well. I am infinitely obliged to you, Mr. Whiffle. Captain Smith, your humble servant, permit me to congratulate you on your laurels. Lady Amelia is rather indisposed. I give you joy, Mr. Whiffle, of your election. Well, I have this moment, said Whiffle, coming at once to the point, met your old friend, Marmaduke Pendragon. Oh, my dear sir, don't mention it. Did you see his wife? Yes. Who is the fair enslaver? Shocking. I declare I am all in a perspiration at the very thought. This odious democracy. He is married to Jake's sister. What, the sister of him we met at his rooms in the temple? The same. Jake's father was a country butcher. Miss Jakes has always lived in the country, apprenticed to a milliner, till her brother sent for her to town. They say it was all a scheme. Oh, poor Marmaduke, I pity him from my soul, one of the first families in the kingdom, and what with the misfortune in my own family. Really? I've not heard, replied Whiffle, putting on a doleful face. What? Is your uncle the baronet dead? Ah, no, mused the pauper. Worse and worse, my dear sir. He is married to Marjorie, his cook, by whom he had 2 children before. And the day after the wedding, Marjorie was delivered of a son and heir. My poor dear Lady Amelia, it almost broke her heart. But she's gone to pay the wedding visit today. See, there is my uncle and his bride driving up the park in their new chariot and liveries. Excuse me, gentlemen, I must go and pay my respects to them, for he has promised to get me a place at court. Well, don't let me detain you, my dear sir, said Whiffle. I hope you'll at least come in for a sop in your aunt's pan. What a wretch, said Smith, is that the pauper. Never was pride and meanness more conspicuous. If he'd continued with us any longer, I could not have restrained my contempt. Pride and meanness, added Whiffle, go together like a blind beggar and his cur. Marmaduke had married a jolly good damsel, and though she is a butcher's daughter, I should prefer her to the pauper's boasted helpmate. I'd rather, said Smith, at a venture take his uncle's cookmaid. The match of the baronet shares all the honours of this imp of quality. If I thought the fellow would be of any service, yes, but, replied Whiffle jocosely, I'd take him into my office and make him an underclerk. He has some years with an attorney, said Smith. I wager anything, replied Whiffle, the law practices upon him before he practices on the law. Well, you forget the place at court, in which the interest of the cookmaid is to get him. Are there no hopes from his wife's noble relations? The Earl has 7 younger sons of his own to provide for. Poor pauper, concluded our hero, then I really pity thee, and think thou art sufficiently punished for thy pride by disappointed poverty. Our hero and his friend Whiffle had by this time arrived at the bottom of the park, and after mutual invitations and promises of renewing their acquaintance, separated. Captain Smith was hastening along Piccadilly when a servant in a handsome livery ran after him, and pointing to a carriage on the other side of the way, said, his mistress begged to speak to him. Our hero had not time to ask the man who was his mistress before the fellow had returned. Our hero was at no period of his life ashamed to speak to anyone who required him, and though he concluded this was some memento of his former folly, perhaps Mrs. Chervil or some of her friends, he very quietly walked across to the carriage. Chapter 18. Epigraph. The Almighty from his throne on earth surveys naught greater than an honest humble heart. A humble heart his residence, pronounced his second seat, and rival to the skies. The private path, the secret acts of men, if noble, far the noblest of our lives. Young. When Captain Smith came nearer, he concluded it was some mistake. A very fashionable chariot with 2 postilions and 2 servants on horseback in elegant liveries has just arrived from the country. A young, handsome female who he did not recollect was looking towards him out of the window, and immediately accosted him. Mr. Smith, I think I can't be mistaken. You don't recollect me, I see. Our hero bowed and smiling added, Yes, ma'am. I remember your countenance, though I cannot exactly... Oh, well, do you forget your namesake you left in the protection of the Count Floreni in Italy? Said the lady in a low tone. The enigma was explained in a moment. My dear ma'am, continued our hero, your looks assure me I see you in health. The Count, I hope, is well. Is he in England? Oh, my husband will be here in a moment, replied the lady, laying an emphasis on the word husband. But I'll not detain you at present. We have a house in P Square. Will you favour us with a call tomorrow? Most likely you are engaged today. Count Floreni and myself will both be most happy to see you. Smith answered in the affirmative and took his leave. When Captain Smith arrived at his lodgings, he related to his friends the occurrences of the day, which afforded them a large field for conversation. They all dined with Mr. Modley, and after dinner the subject turned on the Count Floreni. Mr. Modley said he had heard that noblewoman was in England, and the Countess was an Englishwoman. Our hero replied that he was indebted to her parents for his name, and to the lady herself for the crucifix which had discovered his father, and that he had seen them both in Italy. In the morning Smith called. The house, apartments, and the whole establishment bespoke the noble owner. The Count received our hero with the most visible pleasure. "To you am I indebted for my present happiness," said he. "For you it was that protected and rescued my dear Fanny." The lady was not backward in testifying her acknowledgments, and it afforded no little happiness to our hero to perceive them so well satisfied with one another. "I am come, my dear friend," said the Count, "to fix my residence in this country for life. I found the levelling principle of the French fast approaching in my own country, unable to oppose it. I have sold all my property. The greater part of the purchase money is in the public funds. The rest I have bought an estate and settled it on my dear Fanny. We have 3 children. You shall see them." The Countess walked out of the room. "How happy am I," continued the tenant, "to say they were all born in wedlock. My good girl never concealed from me a single circumstance of her former life. I was pleased with her candour, and have had 1,000 proofs of her affections. I offered of my own accord to marry her, which she herself at first opposed, but I urged the legitimacy of a coming family. We were married, and, if possible, her fidelity and gratitude are increased. It was by her advice I took a farewell of Italy. It is a very lucky circumstance I departed so soon." At this moment the lady entered with the children, 2 boys and a girl, with open and healthy countenances. Captain Smith in his turn gave the Count a concise account of his affairs. As he slightly hinted, he hoped soon to be settled for life, and promised to keep up the acquaintance. The day at last arrived that was to unite our hero with his adored Miss Maudley. Shall I paint the feelings of both upon the occasion, or shall I leave it to thy imagination, reader? The rapturous but delicate sensations which thrilled the anxious nerves of the young captain, the glowing thoughts which warmed his very soul, were so unlike those which Plutus labours to puff into a blaze, or with which the sensual breath of a satire scorches the human frame, that lust or avarice would be little pleased with the description. The dull apathy of pride, the tawdry gloss of honour would still less relish it. When I consider, therefore, the vast numbers who enter into the connubial state as slaves to some vice or other, and remember at the same time the pathetic energy with which a Richardson, a Smollett, and a Fielding, not to mention the many fair females, for in truth, ladies, ye hear the bell, have excelled in the delineation of the matrimonial feelings of true love, I shall act most prudent by waiving my description. As a plain narrator, I shall concisely mention that Captain Smith was married to Miss Maudley. His friend, late Lord Edward, now Marquis of Derry, and his lady, with Mr. Freeman and Sir Harry and Lady Valence, were the only unrelated attendants at the ceremony. Captain Smith and his lovely bride remained a few weeks in town before they set off to the favourite castle of St. Donat's, to which place Mr. Smith and Mr. Maudley and Captain Willis accompanied them, Mr. Freeman having departed to the castle a few days after their marriage. Leaving our young couple to the enjoyment of that happiness the steady virtue of the one and the noble reformation of the other so truly deserved, I shall close my history with a few words containing some other characters mentioned in these pages. The old castle is now comfortably habitable, and Mr. Smith, the father of our hero, blessed with his children and his grandchildren, and living with them, has never for a moment repented the sacrifice he offered up at the altar of vanity. Mr. Maudley and Mrs. Heriot, who reside with him, are also frequent visitors, and generally spend the summer at the castle. Captain Willis has purchased an estate in the neighbourhood for the pleasure of being near his relations. The Marquis of Derry and his beloved Mary are generally at the seat which the Duke gave them at their marriage. He has, as well as his friend Smith, a fine young family, who already love the tutelary genius of their father Freeman, with all the enthusiasm of their parents. Mr. Freeman himself resides at the vicarage that was given him by his Grace, in the same parish with the Marquis, and about 6 miles from St. Donat's. Perfectly satisfied with his present income, he has even refused other preferments at a distance from his beloved spot. I need not repeat the grateful offers which have been made him by his young friends, or say that he is as well beloved as ever, for the practice of those virtues already so fully described. Colonel and Mrs. Grey frequently cross the water. They have no family, and therefore have few inducements to stay at home, but that gives them not the smallest concern, while their acquaintance tell them it is the greatest blessing, as they would certainly spoil them. Old Abraham is yet alive, a venerable and worthy old fixture. Mrs. Mary, not less blooming, still receives our hero when he visits with the Colonel with open arms and a warm salute. Dick has become rather more sedate, boasting 6 fine boys, all of whom, he declares, shall serve his Majesty. Brown, his brother, Captain Smith's former valet, is now promoted to be commander-in-chief at the castle, and major domo in the family. Let us not forget Sir Harry and Lady Valence, their brother Clarendon and his amiable countess, who all seem perfectly happy with their lot, and are never more so than when they make the annual visit into Glamorganshire. Sims acquits himself very well in his parliamentary business, and Whiffle, who has married his sister, talks for them both. In his last letter to Captain Smith, he mentions that his young son, 3 years old, had already showed such an inclination for punning that he believed he must send him to be broke of that bad habit to the pauper, who, as a dernier effort by the recommendation of his uncle, had lately, on a liberal and genteel plan, commenced schoolmaster, taking a few young gentlemen for private tuition. Lady Amelia's noble and sapient relations had sent him a child or two, and his uncle had favoured him with 2 former sons born out of wedlock. Marmaduke's wife proves a notable dame, and by her good management has restored his shattered affairs. She has taken the command of everything into her own hands, drove democracy and infidelity out of his head, taught him the blessings of absolute power, and fixed his belief to whatever she thinks proper. Sir Sandy Simeon Swain, fearful concerning the issue of his lawsuit, proposed an amicable settlement of the affair, which is agreed to. Sir Sandy on certain terms hold the estates for his life, and after him they are settled on Mrs. Smith and her family for ever. Of Mrs. Sherville I have very little to say. The impetuosity of her passions hurried her into a foolish match. Her husband, who is an officer, immediately took her abroad, and they now reside in one of our distant settlements. In traversing over the occurrences of the life of Captain Smith and of his more particular connections and acquaintance, so wide and extensive has been the field that I have been frequently led from the chief and original points. I have curtailed the history in various places. I have omitted many circumstances. I have neglected to enlarge and remark on others, and from the large mass of facts which crowd upon my mind, I have endeavoured to select the most necessary and useful. This will account for the little that has been laid upon some characters which were fully described, especially Mr. Self-Will at the end of the 12th chapter, 1st volume, that he is a gentleman well known to our hero and his friends, and is still strong and hearty. But I must not attempt to apologise, for though I may know when to begin, I shall find it difficult to tell where to leave off. Shall I offer a moral to these pages? Reader, if thou thyself hast not long before found one, to very little purpose have I written them, and to still less hast thou read them. I trust this history is no enigma, which requires a moral at the end by way of solution. Fini.